Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I am Muneeb Hamid with the news of this hour. Let's begin with the headlines first. The United States says Taliban violence in Afghanistan is making it harder for the peace process to move forward. In an interview, General Scott Miller, the head of US forces in Afghanistan, said the fighting in the country is at historic high and it could be more than a spring offensive. It comes after the Taliban urged the US to abide by the Doha peace deal and ensure the withdrawal of the troops from Afghanistan. Pakistan's military has killed 3 terrorists during an intelligence-based operation in the northwestern Pakhtunkhwa province. The military's media wing says the operation on the Aleem Khan Khushali group was carried out in the Mirali area of North Waziristan district. It said the terrorists were involved in target killing, kidnapping for ransom, attacks on security forces and IED explosions. A complete shutdown is being observed in Indian-occupied Kashmir against the visit of New Delhi's cherry-picked EU parliamentarians to endorse New Delhi's false narrative. All parties Hurriyat conference called for the strike, which was supported by all pro-freedom leaders and organizations. The EU Disinfo Lab has revealed that a 2019 visit by largely right-wing MEPs was part of India's propaganda campaign against Pakistan. The United Nations has warned of a potential escalation of violence in Myanmar. UN Special Envoy Tom Andrews' warning comes after deposed leader Aung San Suu Kyi was slapped with an additional charge. Meanwhile, the opponents of the coup have called for bigger protests today to end the military rule. The UK is set to call for a UN resolution to help negotiate ceasefires so that people in conflict zones can be vaccinated against COVID-19. Meanwhile, Brazil has recorded 55,000 new cases and over 1,100 deaths overnight, raising the toll to over 240,000. In Pakistan, over 1,100 people tested positive and 56 more died overnight, with the death toll reaching 12,436. While globally, the coronavirus has claimed over 2.4 million lives and infected 109 million others so far. And these were the top stories. News in detail after a short break. Welcome back. Now let's have the news in detail. The United States says Taliban violence in Afghanistan is making it harder for the peace process to move forward. General Scott Miller, the head of US forces in Afghanistan, said this in an interview. General Miller said the fighting in Afghanistan is at historic high and it could be more than a spring offensive. He added it would be difficult for any side to make compromise if the violence is not reduced. An Afghan National Security Council spokesperson said they are ready for any kind of war, being in a defense mode. It comes after the Taliban urged the US to abide by the Doha peace deal and ensure the withdrawal of the troops from Afghanistan. Now, Pakistan's military has killed 3 terrorists during an intelligence-based operation in the northwest Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. The military's media wing says the operation on the Aleem Khan Khushali group was carried out in the Mirali area of North Waziristan district. It said the terrorists were involved in a target killing, kidnapping for ransom, attacks on security forces and IED explosions. The Inter-Services Public Relations says the area is now being combed to find any terrorists and their aides. A complete shutdown is being observed in Indian-occupied Kashmir against the visit of New Delhi's cherry-picked EU parliamentarians to endorse New Delhi's false narrative.
All parties Hurriyat conference called for the strike, which was supported by all pro-freedom leaders and organizations. The Hurriyat Conference said it seeks to draw the attention of international community towards Indian occupation and oppression. In 2019, a similar visit by largely right-wing MEPs sparked widespread outrage from locals and politicians after they were barred from meeting them. The EU Disinfo Lab revealed in December that the 2019 visit was a part of the malicious propaganda campaign by New Delhi against Pakistan. The investigation revealed how Indian intelligence agencies bribed the MEPs with expensive vacations on tropical island destinations ahead of the visit.
Now, Pakistan says it firmly opposes the creation of a new permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council. Islamabad's envoy to UN says such an expansion will compound the Council's inequality and dysfunctionality. Addressing the second meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiations Framework, Envoy Munir Akram said the addition contradicts the fundamental precepts of equal representatives. He added UNSC reforms can stem through consultations to make the process more inclusive and widely acceptable. The envoy said the idea of a comprehensive reform can only be met through an expansion in the non-permanent category. Moving on now, the US says it has reminded Iraq of its responsibility to protect the coalition forces fighting ISIS in the country. This comes after a recent rocket attack on a U.S. military base in Erbil killed an American contractor and wounded several others. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke to Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi. Blinken discussed efforts to hold culprits of the attack accountable. Earlier, the State Department said the U.S. reserves the right to respond at a time and place of its choosing. The Iraqi Prime Minister also received a call from NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg to discuss military cooperation with Baghdad. NATO defense ministers are set to meet today to discuss several issues, including an expansion of the training mission in Iraq. Now, in France, the lower house of parliament has passed a so-called anti-separatism bill put forward by President Emmanuel Macron's government. The bill will strengthen government oversight of mosques and religious schools, among other measures. Human rights groups say the bill unfairly targets the country's 5.7 million Muslim minority population. Critics call the bill a political maneuver by Macron to win support from conservative voters ahead of next year's presidential election. The incidents of Islamophobia have significantly risen in Europe, prompting concerns from the Muslim world, including Pakistan and Turkey. Meanwhile, the United Nations has warned of a potential escalation of violence in Myanmar. UN Special Envoy Tom Andrews' warning comes after deposed leader Aung San Suu Kyi was slapped with an additional charge. Andrew made an urgent call on any country with influence over the generals and businesses to press them to avoid it. Meanwhile, the opponents of the coup have called for bigger protests today to end the military rule. They say the military's claim of holding new elections is false. The army detained Suu Kyi on February 1st coup, and her next hearing is set for March 1st. She now faces a charge of violating a natural disaster management law, as well as charges of illegally importing 6 walkie-talkie radios. Now, 21 people have died after a historic winter storm swept across multiple states in central and southern United States. The deaths were reported in Texas, Louisiana, Kentucky and Missouri. Authorities say the storm is not expected to relent until the weekend. The storm has left millions without power in Texas and Oregon. Officials drew criticism as the state's energy grid repeatedly failed, forcing rolling blackouts. The National Weather Service says over 150 million Americans are now under winter storm warnings. Meanwhile, the White House says President Joe Biden has assured the federal government's assistance to the governors of the hard-hit states. Now, Brazil has recorded 55,000 new COVID-19 cases and over 1,100 deaths overnight, raising the toll to over 240,000. Globally, the coronavirus has claimed over 2.4 million lives and infected 109 million others so far. More on the pandemic in this report.
While the World Health Organization notes a 16% decrease in the emergency of new COVID-19 cases, The end of the pandemic is a distant reality, especially considering the setbacks in vaccination campaigns and the spread of new variants. The United States has witnessed a drop in new cases and reduced hospitalizations for the fifth week in a row. Meanwhile, more than 55 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine have been administered in the United States. The Mexican government has decided to raise concerns at the United Nations over unequal vaccine access as the country tops 2 million infections.
Tomorrow in the Security Council, we are going to present Mexico and Latin America's position in regards to the inequality, the lack of fairness when it comes to vaccine access. The countries that produce vaccines have very high vaccination rates, and Latin America and the Caribbean much less. We are going to bring this to the Security Council tomorrow because it is not fair.
The United Kingdom is also set to call for a United Nations resolution to help negotiate ceasefires so that people in conflict zones can be vaccinated. Europe's drug regulator authority announced to issue verdict over Johnson & Johnson vaccine by mid-March. Meanwhile, Dutch Prime Minister has called on the nation to respect a nighttime curfew despite a court ruling that the measure lacked a legal basis.
The aim is to control the coronavirus as much as possible so that soon we will have all our freedoms back, but in a safe way. That is why we introduced the curfew, and that is not changed today. That is why I urge everyone to keep following the SOPs should our appeal not result in a suspension of the ruling of the district court.
South Africa says it will offer its doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine to the African Union after scraping their use due to efficacy concerns. South Korean authorities warned against loosening enforcement of SOPs after the number of new cases hit the highest levels in nearly 40 days.
Meanwhile, in Pakistan, 56 more people have died of COVID-19, while over 1,000 tested positive for the virus in the past 24 hours. Health Ministry says the country's death toll has climbed to 12,436. The ministry said the tally of nationwide infections has reached nearly 566,000, of which 528,000 people have recovered. Meanwhile, the number of active COVID-19 cases in the country has dropped to 25,000. The ministry said over 1,600 patients are in the critical condition. Pakistan's foreign minister has urged the Egyptian companies to benefit from ample investment opportunities in Pakistan. On his second-day official visit to Cairo, Shah Mahmood Qureshi assured the Egyptian investors of every possible cooperation by Islamabad. Talking to a delegation of businessmen, Qureshi said both countries should further enhance their bilateral trade. The minister noted Pakistan's improved ease of doing business rating depicts the confidence of international community. Meanwhile, the Egyptian companies expressed their interest in investment in Pakistan's healthcare, energy and construction sectors. Egyptian company Elsewedy Electric's CEO also called on foreign minister and showed interest to invest in Pakistan. Now, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and his Swiss counterpart Guy Parmelin have discussed ways to revive the 2015 nuclear deal. Rouhani told Parmelin the latest developments on a phone call. In a statement, Iranian President's office said both leaders exchanged views on Swiss humanitarian trade arrangement and regional security. Meanwhile, in a tweet, Parmelin said he also discussed Switzerland's mandate to provide good officers for Iran and the United States. The United States says the path to diplomacy is open right now with Iran over the 2015 nuclear deal. But U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Iran is still far away from compliance with the deal. Talking to National Public Radio, Blinken said Iran resumes compliance with the JCPOA and the U.S. would do too. He added any presumable future engagement with Iran will require diplomacy. The Secretary of State did not address whether new U.S. administration has had any direct engagement with Iranian officials as yet. This comes after Iran told the UN nuclear watchdog it will scale back cooperation with it in a week. Now, the US has urged the Houthi rebels to cease all military operations in Yemen's northern province of Marib. In a statement, U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price asked the rebels to return to the negotiation table. Price said assaults by the Houthis will only exacerbate Marib's humanitarian crisis. He added if Houthis want a negotiated solution, they must cease all destabilizing actions, including attacks on Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, U.S. Special Envoy to Yemen said Washington is aggressively using back-channel diplomacy to speak to Houthis. Timothy Lender-King said Washington is working to energize international diplomatic efforts to create the right conditions for a ceasefire. Earlier, a UN report estimated that 1 million Yemenis have sought refuge in Marib since the beginning of the war to escape the Houthi violence. Now, the United States says it is planning to recalibrate its relations with Saudi Arabia. This represents an abrupt change in U.S. policy from President Joe Biden's predecessor, Donald Trump. Talking to reporters, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said Biden is returning to counterpart engagement. Psaki said the president will communicate through King Salman bin Abdul Aziz as he is the U.S. president's counterpart. She said the two leaders will have a conversation at an appropriate time, and Washington will work with Riyadh while highlighting areas of disagreement and concern.
We've made clear from the beginning that we're going to recalibrate our relationship with Saudi Arabia, and that President Biden, and one of the questions there was also, just to go back to the context of it, whether he would be speaking with MBS. And part of that is going back to engagement counterpart to counterpart. The president's counterpart is King Salman.
Well, now moving on, the United States says it believes Russia's Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline project is a bad deal for Europe. This comes amid Biden administration's review of the gas pipeline project from Russia to Germany. Talking to reporters, White House spokesperson Jen Psaki said Washington will determine if sanctions are in order to stop the project. Psaki said the pipeline will divide Europe and exposes Ukraine and Central Europe to Russian manipulation. She added the project goes against Europe's own stated energy and security goals.
Our position on Nord Stream 2 has been very clear, and it remains unchanged. President Biden has made clear that Nord Stream 2 is a bad deal. It's a bad deal because it divides Europe, it exposes Ukraine and Central Europe to Russian manipulation, and because it goes against Europe's own stated energy and security goals. We're continuing to monitor activity to complete or to certify the pipeline.
More news coming up in this news bulletin after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now moving on with the news stories. UN Special Envoy for Libya, Jan Kubis, has arrived in Tripoli on his first visit to the country after the appointment. In a statement, the UN mission said Kubis met several officials and stakeholders from the Libyan factions. They said the officials discussed the successful outcome of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum in Switzerland. The delegates spoke about the importance of full implementation of the roadmap, including a smooth transition of power. Meanwhile, the Turkish ambassador to Libya also hosted Kubis at their embassy in Tripoli. The Turkish envoy affirmed Ankara's full support for the UN mission to ensure stability and approval of the new Libyan government. Now, Europe's highest and most active volcano has erupted, sending thick smoke into the sky over the Italian island of Sicily. Mount Etna, whose last major eruption was in 1992, rained down ash and stones on the nearby countryside. The 3,330-meter-high volcano can burst several times a year. The latest eruption has forced Italian authorities to close down the nearby airport of Catania. However, officials say they are monitoring the situation and the eruption poses no danger to nearby villages as of now. Yemen has become one of the most dangerous places in the world for children to grow up. The United Nations has warned that 400,000 children are in danger of death from famine. Half of Yemen's children are facing malnutrition. Details in this report.
Years of an armed conflict, economic decline, and the COVID-19 pandemic have pushed Yemenis to the brink of deadly malnutrition crisis, with rising levels of food insecurity. The United Nations says the humanitarian response remains critically underfunded. Clean drinking water, sanitation, food assistance, and livelihood support are an extremely rare luxury as diseases make matters worse. About 1.2 million pregnant or breastfeeding women are also expected to suffer from extreme malnutrition in 2021. Many families have to resort to reducing the quantity or quality of the food they eat, and in some cases, families are forced to do both.
We have one meal a day, sometimes two, but often my husband and I don't eat at all so that our children can eat.
The fragile healthcare system is facing a collateral impact of COVID-19, which has drained meager resources and resulted in fewer people seeking medical care. The World Food Programme has reiterated that the war in Yemen has to stop.
It shows that after years of conflict, the Yemeni people can't take it anymore. They can't feed their families, and they don't have the means to survive without massive assistance going into the country every month. The World Food Programme supports 13 million people every month. The war has to stop, and in the meantime, we have to continue to support the Yemenis so that they can feed their families, the children can survive, and we have these figures reduce.
More than 3 million people have been displaced, and close to 80% of the 29 million population is in need of aid for survival. The United Nations says in 2020 it received only $1.43 billion of the $3.2 billion needed to fund aid projects in Yemen.
Now, NASA's Perseverance rover is expected to attempt a spectacular but treacherous landing on Mars later this week. The six-wheeled NASA rover will take 7 minutes to descend from the top of the Martian atmosphere to the planet's surface. Details in this report.
NASA's Mars mission may set the stage for scientists to show whether life has existed beyond Earth while paving the way for more human missions to the planet. Al Chen, head of the descent and landing team of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, has said landing is the most critical and dangerous part of the $2.7 billion mission. In a historic first, the rover will also drill samples from the Martian rock and seal them into tubes for return to Earth for further analysis.
Our journey has been from following the water to seeing whether this planet was habitable, to finding complex chemicals, and now we're at the advent of an entirely new phase, returning samples, an aspirational goal that has been with the science community for decades.
The primary objective of the 2-year mission is engaging a complex suite of instruments in the search for signs of microbial life on Mars. Perseverance also has small drone helicopter aboard that will test surface-to-surface powered flight on another world for the first time. However, one of the most important experiments the rover will undertake is testing a device to extract oxygen from carbon dioxide in the Martian atmosphere.
MOXIE uses a thermal and electrochemical process to convert carbon dioxide into oxygen. At the cathodes in the electrolytic cells, CO2 plus 2 electrons become CO, carbon monoxide, plus doubly charged O anion.
The extraction of oxygen could prove invaluable for future human life support on Mars and for producing rocket propellant to fly astronauts back home. The success of the mission hinges on a complex sequence of events, from inflation of a parachute to deployment of a jet-powered crane for safe landing. Perseverance is the 5th and by far most sophisticated rover vehicle NASA has sent to Mars in decades.
Now, European stocks have edged down as fast-spreading new COVID-19 variants worry investors who mull the effectivity of vaccines. Frankfurt's DAX is leading the losses, dipping close to 0.5%. Italy's FTSE MIB, the Pan-European Stock 600, London's FTSE and the CAC 40 in Paris too edged down marginally. Earlier, stocks in the Asia-Pacific are trading mixed. Seoul's Kospi, Australia's ASX 200, Japan's Nikkei shed, while Hong Kong's Hang Seng gained. Markets in mainland China are closed for the Lunar Year holidays. And now let's have a look at the weather updates. And that is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.